Good morning and welcome to the 20th meeting of the Health and Sport Committee in 2020. I take this opportunity to welcome Donald Cameron back to the committee. I would also like to thank Miles Briggs for his work while on the committee. Miles has asked me to pass his thanks on to all colleagues for the work of the committee over his period of membership. And of course, as he is his party's nominated substitute, he may well be back. We have also received apologies for this morning's meeting from Alex Cole-Hamilton. Willie Rennie is attending in his place, so welcome also to Willie Rennie. Our first item on the agenda is, as a result, a declaration of interests. I remind members that any declaration should be brief but sufficiently detailed to make clear to any listener the nature of the interest. In accordance with Section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I now invite Donald Cameron to declare any new interests relevant to the remit of the committee. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. I have no further interest to declare.
Thank you very much. And also in accordance with Section 3 of the Code of Conduct, I ask Willie Rennie to declare any interests relevant to the remit. Willie.
I have nothing to declare, Convener.
Thank you very much. The second item on our agenda is subordinate legislation, consideration of made affirmative instruments. We have 6 sets of regulations to cover, all linked to the quarantine arrangements as a consequence of COVID-19. The regulations were laid during July and this month and all referred to our committee because they are laid under Section 94(1) International Travel of the Public Health etc. Scotland Act 2008. Section 1225 of the 2008 Act states that such regulations are subject to the affirmative procedure. However, Section 1226 provides that the affirmative procedure will not apply if Scottish ministers consider that the regulations need to be made urgently. In such situations, Section 1227 applies. That section sets out that emergency regulations must be laid before the Scottish Parliament and cease to have effect on the expiry of the period of 28 days, beginning with the date in which the regulations were made, unless before the expiry of that period, the regulations have been approved by a resolution of Parliament. It is for this committee to consider these instruments and report to Parliament accordingly. So this morning we will have an evidence session with the Cabinet Secretary for Justice and officials on the instrument. Once we have asked all our questions, we will have the formal debate on the motions after the evidence session. The instruments we are looking at today are the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Scotland Amendment Regulations 2020, numbers 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 and 8. And the committee will also have a number of questions linked to an earlier session with the Cabinet Secretary when we considered the Health Protection Coronavirus International Travel Regulations 2020, the original of this series. So I welcome once again to the committee Humza Yousaf, Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and he is accompanied this morning by Rachel Sunderland, Deputy Director, Population and Migration Division of the Government, Roger Halliday, Chief Statistician, and Jamie McDougall, Deputy Director with the Test and Protect portfolio, also in the scope. Cabinet Secretary, with your agreement, we intend to ask a single question on all of these instruments in a single session. Therefore, the questions that you will receive from members will be covering the whole range of quarantine regulations, including in particular those on which we have to make a decision this morning. We will take questions in a pre-arranged order, as is a necessity with online meetings of committees. And I will start with the first questions before turning to colleagues and asking each member in turn to ask questions. So if I may start, Cabinet Secretary, each set of regulations made under these emergency health regulation powers required to be reviewed at least every 21 days. Can you tell us if the results of these reviews are to be published and made available to the Scottish Parliament? Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, good morning, Convener, and good morning to the whole committee. I hope everybody is keeping well and keeping safe. So you're right, the formal review process is every 3 weeks. So you'll appreciate through the amendments that we're laying, actually we end up reviewing all the countries, for example, on an exempt list on a weekly basis. because of the data that we receive. But you're right to say that the formal review is every 21 days. So the next review is at the end of the month, is in August the 31st. In answer to your question about that being published, we tend to do the reviews. The outcome of each review is communicated to the Parliament through a written parliamentary question, a GIQ, and that's what we intend to do on the 31st of August as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Turning to the substance of the issues, clearly we've heard from you previously, and I'm sure you'll want to expand a little on your earlier comments. But can you tell us, in relation to the current position, how many travellers are currently in quarantine? How many have required to enter quarantine since the measures were introduced? And is it now the case that 20% of all travellers who entered Scotland since the introduction of quarantine measures have been contacted?
Thanks, Convener. So I've got a list of my kind of latest detailed stats, if I can make sure I get these correct for you. So you asked how many travellers are currently in quarantine. So circa 16,000 over the last 2 weeks have been quarantined. So obviously, quarantine is over a period of 14 days. So over the last 2 weeks, approximately 16,000 have been in quarantine. Overall, since the measures were introduced, my understanding is 36,826 have been in quarantine. But I will absolutely confirm those stats, and if there's any disparity in those stats, I'll ask my officials to come in. Now, that may seem like it's quite heavily skewed in terms of the last 2 weeks, and ultimately, as we remove countries where there's quite a large number of travellers that come in, i.e. Spain and France, from the exempt list, then that is why perhaps the figures are relatively high for the last 2 weeks. In terms of the 20% figure, you of course will know, and the committee will have seen the letter that I sent to give clarification on that. So I referenced 20% up to a maximum of 450 a week. Now that 450 a week figure was used because that is ultimately what the National Contact Tracing Centre thought they could allocate in relation to resource and staffing availability. They've managed to exceed in many cases, in fact most cases, they've managed to exceed that 450 figure. Now we thought originally when we forecast passenger numbers that 450 would approximately be 20% of passenger numbers. Clearly that's not the case, and hence my clarification to you in the letter. Now passenger numbers will vary because countries come on and off the exempt list. As countries come in and out of lockdown, of course, passenger numbers will vary. So we are, in some cases, for example, Public Health Scotland have managed to get up to, as it was last week, I understand, around 14%. We're clearly working with them to get to that 20% figure. I mean, 20% is not a magical, statistically significant number, but it would provide us with even more assurance than we currently have. So yes, they're meeting and in many cases exceeding the 450 a week that I referenced in my letter to you, but that isn't equating to 20%. And we're working with Public Health Scotland to understand the resource pressures that would put and see if we can get up to that 20%.
So I think what you're saying is that what's being achieved is 450 or sometimes a little bit. The aspiration is for 20%, and the reason that you're not achieving your aspiration is because there isn't sufficient resource or personnel at the National Contact Tracing Centre to deliver that.
In summary, that would be correct. But what we'd have to do is remove people from other contact tracing jobs in order to do this. So yes, we'll have that conversation with Public Health Scotland, see if we can get to that 20%, which is, as you say, I would think would give us even more confidence in the measures. But currently, as I say, we're often, or Public Health Scotland are often exceeding the 450 contacts a week.
And can you tell us, and you've given us some numbers, quite significant numbers of people who've been in quarantine over the period, can you tell us how many of those travellers subject to quarantine have developed positive symptoms for COVID-19?
So how many have developed positive symptoms for COVID-19? So that figure isn't published. Public Health Scotland do have information about people who travel to Scotland internationally, who then test positive for COVID-19. As with all people obviously testing positive for COVID-19, Public Health Scotland follows up with the contacts that they may have met in recent days. But the figures are currently unpublished. The numbers are low, so we will work with Public Health Scotland to explore what can be published, but also in a way that respects people's privacy, because if the numbers are very low, we just have to make sure that we're not inadvertently identifying individuals.
If 16,000 people have been quarantined over the last 2 weeks, and we're talking a low number, it's difficult to see how publishing that information would identify individuals. Is there any particular barrier to publishing those numbers?
So again, it is largely around people's privacy, because although the number, you're right, is high, people may come from a country that has a very few number of travellers coming into Scotland on a regular basis, and therefore, if they are part of one of those countries, so not Spain, not France, but one of the other countries that are on the on the quarantine list, but there's low numbers that are coming in, then they may well be identified. So, as I say, I mean, it's not a figure that we publish, or Public Health Scotland publish, but I'm not opposed, certainly not opposed, in fact, actively consider whether or not we can publish those figures.
Okay, that would certainly be useful. I mean, clearly the reassurance that the public are looking for would, and also the evidence for Parliament that these measures are effective is an important consideration, and publication of those numbers would certainly help with that. Where a country's been added to a list or taken off the exempt list, and therefore quarantine is required, clearly people will have arrived here during the days before that decision was made. Is there any measure to check those who, for example, those who arrived from Spain before Spain was added or taken off the exempt list? Is there any measure to check those who arrived before the change in regulation?
So not if they were part of the exempt list. 100% of people who arrive who are meant to be quarantining will get an email. But if you arrive in a window whereby we make a decision that, of course, for various operational reasons, for border force or whatever, there's a 24 or 48-hour window, then no, you're arriving at a time where we deem that exemption to still be in place, and therefore there wouldn't be a necessary follow-up. But of course, people will know to follow the public health guidance that if they develop symptoms, then to immediately book a test and to self-isolate and to follow the other public health guidance as it exists.
Thank you very much. Roger Halliday, I think, wanted to come in. Roger Halliday.
It was just only on the point about privacy there. That I mean, that's there are numbers of people coming in from countries that they're the only person that's tested positive from that country. So that has potential to be quite highly disclosive. And also, what we've also got to consider is some of the behavioural effects of identifying that people from particular countries are coming in to Scotland in particular places and testing positive. And so an important consideration for privacy here is the effects that sort of, or I guess, concerns that have been expressed about views on bringing COVID into the country that may be unwanted. So I think that was my judgment on publishing and keeping these sort of things pretty tightly private.
I understand the point, but I think what the Cabinet Secretary was saying was that in principle the objective of government is to make your understanding.
Sorry, I didn't hear behalf
The
of that.
Cabinet Secretary said that he was working towards and supportive of making these numbers public, and is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think there's that what I want to do with Public Health Scotland is to understand how we might make some of the data private, some of the data public, but we need to do that in a way that doesn't identify individuals, and so we'll probably need to present that in quite an aggregate form rather than identifying individual countries that people return from.
Thank you very much. I now understand your point. Finally, Cabinet Secretary, before I hand over to colleagues, coming back to the question of numbers contacted, because if you were contacting 20% of 16,000 over the last 2 weeks, I guess that would be over 3,000 people contacted. But the reality is, I think you're saying very significantly less than that, Cabinet Secretary.
So as I'm saying, we are contacting and exceeding the 450. You're right, it doesn't equate to 20%. There's no point trying to equivocate around that issue. It's not reaching the 20%. But I go back to saying, the 20% is not a magical statistical number. It would provide, for sure, a very robust sample size, but I wouldn't dismiss the in excess of 450 that have been contacted over the week, which gives us a good indication of, it's a good number to have been contacted. But you're right, it doesn't equate to the 20%. No point pretending otherwise. I would like Public Health Scotland to get to that 20%, but also I'd like to understand what the staffing and resource implications would be, and I'd want to make sure there's not a detriment to other parts of the contact tracing operation.
Thank you very much. And I call David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and witnesses. How many travellers subject to quarantine have breached the regulations?
Cabinet Secretary.
So again, you would need to look at the various different offences that exist. So there's an information offence if you don't fill out the passenger locator form, and Border Force would follow that up. And that applies to everybody, regardless of quarantining or not quarantining. And then, of course, there's the offences related to quarantining. As you know, Police Scotland take a reactive approach to that in the normal course of duties, or indeed, as you know, as we've made public, Public Health Scotland, if they fail to contact somebody after a number of attempts and have reasonable suspicion of a breach, then they'll pass that information on to Police Scotland, who will then follow that up. So we wouldn't have figures because of the nature that David Stewart asks for, because we don't expect Police Scotland to knock on the door of every single person that's quarantining. That's 16,000 people in 2 weeks. We wouldn't expect Police Scotland to spend their time knocking on every single person's door to follow up to check if they're quarantining or not. But where they have followed up, they'll take the 4Es approach, where they will engage, they'll educate, they'll encourage, and they will enforce if necessary. So far, as you probably know, there's only been that one fixed penalty notice that's been issued by Police Scotland for the infamous case of Bolingoli, the Celtic player who was disingenuous in relation to his quarantining.
Thank you, Convener. If I can perhaps pressurise the Cabinet Secretary to give me a bit more practical information there. So, for example, how many travellers subject to quarantine have been interviewed by Police Scotland for alleged breaches of the regulations? I mean, do you actually have these statistics, Cabinet Secretary? If not, could you write to the committee with the information?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I will ask my officials online, but that would be for Police Scotland to answer in relation to how many people they've interviewed, or how many people they've knocked the door of, or how many people they've called, how many people they've engaged with, etc., etc. So that would really be for Police Scotland, but I'm happy to defer to my officials to see if they have any update. You will know that Police Scotland do publish the figures. The committee will know that of the number of contacts that they receive from Public Health Scotland to follow up. My understanding is that they would follow up the vast majority, if not all of those contacts. What form that takes Is it an interview? I doubt it. I mean, I would suspect it's probably either a chap at the door or a phone call. But again, I'm happy to defer to any of my officials online if they have any more detailed information.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. In previous comments to Parliament, you rightly have said that you're in regular contact with the Chief Constable. I think, if I remember rightly, you said on a weekly basis, either on phone or Zoom, perhaps not in person. When you're discussing this issue with the Chief Constable, there's clearly resource issues for Police Scotland. This is a massive new bit of responsibility for them with the quarantine regulations. Do Police Scotland have the resources to carry out these interviews? Because there could be quite a large breaching of current quarantine regulations. There may only have been one that's got publicity, but there are lots of travellers from countries that are not exempt that would require, that could potentially be breaching the regulations. This is a job of Police Scotland. Do you have the resources to carry this out?
Cabinet Secretary.
So I think there's a misunderstanding of what Police Scotland's role is in relation to the quarantining measures. You're right, I speak to Police Scotland at the very least on a weekly basis, often twice a week at least. And I speak to the senior management team as well as the Chief Constable on regular occasion. And we do speak about the quarantine measures and have spoken about them. But do remember that Police Scotland's role in this, as I said in my previous committee appearance, is reactive. There is no expectation from me, and neither has the expectation ever been publicly, that Police Scotland would be knocking the door of every single person that should be quarantining. That was never the intention, never the implication, and certainly never the insinuation. What they would always do, and again I referenced this in my previous committee appearance, as well as I think in my letter to you, reiterate that Police Scotland's role is a reactive role. That is, if we required Police Scotland to knock on the door of every single one of the contacts that's quarantining for every 2-week period, they wouldn't be attending domestic abuse cases or investigating murders. They would be checking whether people are quarantining or not, and that's simply not an appropriate use of resource. In terms of Police Scotland's resource itself, Police Scotland have told me that the contacts that are passed on to them from Public Health Scotland, which again are published, are public figures, although I think maybe the figures that are published at the moment are slightly older, so we need to get an update on that. They don't overwhelm Police Scotland. They're not huge in number. So Police Scotland have a number of jobs to do at the moment in terms of the coronavirus regulations, a number of additional responsibilities. Add that onto business as usual, as they're starting to see with crime rates. Add to that the pressures of an imminent no-deal Brexit, potentially, and the public order issues that might bring. And add to that the pressures of COP26, which is postponed until next year, but still a huge amount of planning needs to be done. I don't think I would expect Police Scotland to have or take an approach where they would be checking up on every single person that's quarantining. The last thing I would say is it is the individual's responsibility to ensure they are following the laws and the rules of and we don't live in a police state.
Yeah. To you, Convener, I think actually the Cabinet Secretary has made my point for me, which is that obviously there's a lot more responsibility on the police and perhaps they need no resources for this. And I think perhaps the Cabinet Secretary is misunderstanding my point. At no point did I suggest the police should be visiting everyone in quarantine. This is the government's own rules. The government's own rules require an enforcement action reactively. We understand that. That's why the committee's here looking at these regulations. My point is how many and how much enforcement action have Police Scotland carried out when they've been told reactively there's a breach of quarantine? That's a simple point. And you were exaggerating, Cabinet Secretary, with all the greatest respect. I did not say that everyone in quarantine should be visited by the police. I'm merely saying, once it's been pointed out to police there's been a breach of regulations, what is their action on this?
Okay, so the very simple answer to that question would be that there's been one fixed penalty notice that's been issued. So in terms of actual enforcement, and in terms of a fixed penalty notice, there's been one of that very infamous case. And the other follow-ups that Police Scotland have done, they've obviously judged it from an operational basis that after they've engaged with the other 3 E's, i.e. engage, educate and encourage, that they have been satisfied that no further action has been necessary.
Yeah. Well, I would say before I move on, Convener, I'm conscious of time. There's a famous American expression, if it waddles and it quacks, it's a duck. One enforcement action for all these people in quarantine is frankly, I think, quite ridiculous in terms of enforcement. But I'll move on. What discussions finally have taken place prior to the introduction of the regulations about the sharing of relevant information between Public Health Scotland and the Home Office?
Cabinet Secretary.
So just on his point, he may want to follow up with Police Scotland. He'll understand as Cabinet Secretary for Justice. I don't direct the police in relation to their operational responsibility. So if he thinks it's ridiculous that Police Scotland have only issued one fixed penalty notice, he should really absolutely has every right to take that up with the Chief Constable, who I don't doubt will give him a very measured and detailed response of why the Chief Constable and his officers have thought that operationally has been the correct response. But really, it is not for ministers, far be it for politicians, to, I think, direct the operational responsibility of the Chief Constable. On his point around discussions that have taken place, he's right, discussions have taken place between Public Health Scotland and the Home Office, and that those conversations began in late May, continued, as he knows, in June around the potential sharing of data, the MOU for data transfer. So there's been a fair bit of discussion. I'm not sure if he wants any particular detail, but if he does, then I'd be happy to provide what we can in writing.
Perhaps then finally, Convener, could I just ask, are any discussions between Public Health Scotland and the Home Office, have any of these meetings been recorded? Is it possible the committee could have some further information about that, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would have to look. I mean, I'm not involved directly in those conversations that take place between Public Health Scotland and the Home Office. As I say, discussions absolutely have taken place. I would have to look at what could be put in the public domain and what wouldn't be able to be put in the public domain. So if I can take that away from Dave Stewart, I'm more than happy to look at that issue and come back to the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Justice Secretary. I'm a bit confused about the fluctuating position on the numbers that are to be spot checked who are in quarantine. Because when you were last at the committee, you said it was 20% and we discovered it was none. And then you clarified that it was 20% up to a maximum of 450. Then today you're saying it's an aspiration to still get to 20%. But if you look at the quarantine statistics that were published last week by Public Health Scotland, they say that on the average up until the end of July, they were getting about 600 contacts. But then they say this, the high level will not be maintained indefinitely as the number of positive cases and sources will be prioritised to contact tracing those cases. So I'm confused, Justice Secretary, if they're saying that last week, why are you saying you're going to increase the number of cases to the committee this morning?
Cabinet Secretary.
So forgive me, I lost a little bit of Willie Rennie, but I think I got the gist of what he was asking. So for us, Parliament, including Willie Rennie, who I think has been very constructive in his engagement generally around the pandemic, politicians, opposition, and indeed many others have said to us that they would like to see Public Health Scotland get to that 20% figure that we have articulated previously. And I won't rehearse what I've said already to the convener around why we had that figure and why the passenger numbers have varied. But I would like to see Public Health Scotland exceed the number that they already are contacting, because for me, I think the more numbers that are contacted, the larger the sample size, then the more confidence not just we can have, and I have a very fair degree of confidence in the numbers. I think Parliament
could I just Can I just stop you there? I don't know if the bit that was missed was that last week the statistical report from Public Health Scotland said they were going to reduce the numbers being spot checked, but today you're saying they're going to be increased. I mean, did you speak to Public Health Scotland before you came to the committee? Because I genuinely want to get to the answer on this, but you seem to be saying two different things.
No, positions can evolve. That is often the case, particularly during a pandemic. So I'm telling you that the latest position is that, and I thought this would have been welcomed, that the latest position is that I would want to understand from Public Health Scotland what would be the implications if we were to ask them to increase the numbers contacted. I would quite like to see the numbers increased, because I would like to see it as a larger percentage of the numbers of passengers that are having to quarantine. So that is the latest position. That is the position that myself and officials are exploring with Public Health Scotland. I would need to understand what the implications are on Public Health Scotland and the contact tracing operation before a final definitive decision was made. Now, that is absolutely the current position, which I would hope would be welcomed by all.
Yes, I would welcome that if that was the case, but I just fear that the Public Health Scotland capacity will be tested, especially as we've seen a number of different outbreaks in recent weeks, and an increase in the number of people who are being tested as well. So just moving on slightly, I mean, the spot check process was unable to identify or contact around about 650, 700 people since the spot checks were started. Now, the reports to the police from Public Health Scotland was only 19 though, so I'm wondering, who are these people that we've not been able to contact? Are you confident that they're complying with the guidance to quarantine? And if not, what are we going to do about it?
Cabinet Secretary.
So first of all, can I say what Willie Rennie said at the beginning of his question, I think is very fair comment. I think that's exactly what we're trying to do, is figure out what the implications for Public Health Scotland would be on the contact tracing operation if we were to increase, which is what I would like us to do, the number of contacts made. And therefore I'll report back to Parliament once those conversations have come to a firm conclusion, and I'd hope that we get in a position where we'd be able to increase the number of contacts without a detriment to the contact tracing operation overall. In terms of the question of the figures, sometimes there can be a bit of a lag between the figures that are published by Police Scotland in relation to the contacts that are referred on from Public Health Scotland and the latest position. So I will write to the committee in terms of the latest figures that are verified from Police Scotland, in terms of how many numbers have been passed on from Public Health Scotland. What Public Health Scotland will tend to do as they're sampling contacts and contacting them, they will try on numerous occasions to get through to somebody. If they are unable to do so and have a reasonable suspicion that there may be falsified information there, or indeed any concerns around the quarantining, then those contacts will be passed on to Police Scotland for a follow-up. But I will try to get the committee the most up-to-date figures, because often there can be a lag between the figures that are public, between Public Health Scotland and necessarily the data that's published from Police Scotland.
I think this is not a lag. I mean, this is getting on to 700 people that we've not been able to spot check, and that's a big percentage of those overall that we tried to contact. So I'm surprised you don't know who these people are and why we've not been able to contact them, and therefore why only small numbers have actually apparently been referred to the police. This seems to be a massive gap in our knowledge. What we're doing about it.
Well, remember, every single person that should be quarantining will be contacted by email. So every single person will be contacted. And the email success rate is just shy of 99%. So 99% of emails from Public Health Scotland are getting through to the email address. So every single person, virtually minus 1%, is being contacted in terms of people that have been quarantined. So you have to think of the measures in their whole. It's not just about the sample that Public Health Scotland will look to contact. Every single person will get the public health guidance via an email, plus the expectation that they should be quarantining, and indeed what measures Public Health Scotland can take, i.e. passing the details on to Police Scotland if necessary. But I'm happy to take the question of the 700 that have not been able to be spot checked and come back to whether any, unless any of my officials online have anything to add to Mr. Rennie's question.
I see no indications from officials, so will you let me final?
Not fine. Move on.
Thank you very much. Now call Emma Harper.
Thank you. Thanks, convener. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I'm interested to know, when was the four-nation quarantine approach first discussed, and when was it agreed it would be implemented from the 8th of June? And prior to that, what discussions had taken place about how information would need to be shared between all four nations?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say, generally speaking, that the relationship with the four nations has been positive. In the beginning, it was a bit challenging to get some of the data when we initially knew it was available to the UK government, but I think we've managed to get through those issues. And generally speaking, the relationship is a strong one, and there's a fair number of discussions that take place. Again, I think we've said this quite publicly before. Scottish Government ministers, we'd argued for the introduction of health measures or health controls at the borders for some time, but we were also very cognizant of the fact that it would be better to do those as a four nations approach and a four nations basis. So these discussions progressed as rapidly as they possibly could. The 8th of June was agreed at a date where all countries could implement, and as I say, we're in very regular, constant contact about any updates to sectoral exemptions or indeed country-specific exemptions.
Emma Harper.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Is the UK Government providing the Scottish Government with updates from the Joint Biosecurity Centre, which is the Institute for Government's Joint Biosecurity Centre, on international infection rates on a weekly basis? Are you getting that information efficiently once a week?
Cabinet Secretary.
I would say the information flows in a good place. Now we're getting that regularly. We're getting that, I think, as soon as the UK Government is getting that, which is positive. It wasn't always thus, but I have to say it's certainly improved in the last number of weeks. So I have little concern at the moment as things stand in terms of the data that we receive from the Joint Biosecurity Centre, and also Public Health England is coming to us in a timious manner.
Emma Harper.
Cabinet Secretary, are you secure enough in the approach, or that it's secure to protect Scotland, given that the greatest risk of infection is from travellers arriving in Scotland who might be carrying the virus? Since our own population, the R number is pretty low.
Cabinet Secretary.
So we tend to look at the prevalence point as one of the data points. There's a whole range of data that's explored and looked at, and we rely on essentially two assessments on whether or not a country should be exempt or should be or people should be quarantining from those countries. That is data from the Joint Biosecurity Centre, but also a risk analysis that's done by Public Health England as well. And those two assessments put together then allow us to have a discussion about what countries should be exempt or not. For me, the measures we've got in place are good, they're robust. Countries right across the world have quarantine measures in place, as they are seen as a very robust measure in the fight against inbound transmission. That doesn't mean there won't be imported cases from abroad. It'd be foolish to suggest that there won't be a single imported case. Of course, there will be, but what we're aiming to do with the measures is to minimise that risk. I know one country, Iceland as an example. I mean, they began testing people in terms of, I think, temperature checks, if I remember correctly, at the border initially, but they then moved to a quarantine position because it was seen to be more effective. So I think the quarantining of people when they travel into a country for 14 days is seen as a robust measure. So I have confidence in the measure.
Emma Harper.
Okay, thanks. Just a final question. It's about people coming into the country then. The data that we have says that the Border Force have notified that 17,633 passengers have arrived at Scottish airports. And I know that number's probably out of date now, but it does specifically refer to airports. And I did ask previously about ferry travel, or if someone flies into Dublin and then get a ferry from either Larne or Belfast into Cairnryan, for example. Is the Cabinet Secretary satisfied that passengers entering Scotland are being invited to have their accurately completed information, for instance, on the forms? And it also obviously applies to the ferry travellers as well as the airport travellers.
Cabinet Secretary.
Emma Harper's absolutely right. It does apply to people travelling in from ferry. If you are coming from a non-exempt country, so even if you have spent a period of time in an exempt country, so Northern Ireland is, or indeed the Republic of Ireland as part of the common travel area, if you would then have to quarantine for 14 days minus the amount of time that you've spent in an exempt country, but you would still be expected, if you were coming into Scotland, to then be, if you still had to quarantine, to be providing that information to the Border Force. I don't have the numbers, Emma Harper, forgive me, of those that have travelled in by ferry, and I'll have a look at if I can get that disaggregated data for Emma Harper. My assumption would be that the vast majority of people that are travelling by ferry are coming from an exempt country, i.e. Northern Ireland or the Republic, but for her interest into Scotland. But there may well be people who are coming from a non-exempt country, and therefore they would have to fill out the passenger locator form and also quarantine for the 14 days. But I'll see if I can get some figures and come back to Emma Harper on that.
Cabinet Secretary, it would be very helpful if you were to come back to the committee with numbers, and it's striking that David Stewart and Willie Rennie and Emma Harper have all asked questions for which you don't have the information to hand. Clearly it was a choice of the government to bring forward these regulations as emergency measures under the Public Health Act 2008, and I wonder if, as the Cabinet Secretary, are you satisfied that this approach taken with all these instruments gives the Scottish Parliament appropriate opportunity to scrutinise actions and intended actions of the government in such an important incident? Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, well, let me take just slight issue with your commentary before that. It's striking that we don't have figures to hand. I mean, some of the figures that I'm being asked about. So if I take Dave Stewart's question previously, to me it seemed to suggest that was the next. Do police have enough resource? I don't know what figure exactly he was asking for, but I'm more than happy to look at it. Other figures. Actually, for Willie Rennie's question, simply I was making the point that every single person quarantining will be contacted. He's asking me to take a look at the 700 that he says haven't been contacted, and all I've said is I'll come back to just double check what measures have been put in place for those. But the figures are published that we have. Figures that aren't published, what I'm saying is I'll take a look at what we can provide publicly, because I think transparency is hugely important. And as for ferry figures, again, I don't think we disaggregate. So it's not a case of, I'm not sure why it would be striking necessarily, but the people that should be contacted or would be part of the sample that would be contacted, it's not relevant whether they come in via air or whether they come in via ferry. If they should be contacted to be part of that sample or part of that cohort, that then be sampled. So let me see if I can answer the substance of your question in terms of the security, the Parliament scrutiny. And obviously, these matters move at an extraordinarily quick pace, and we often rely on data from foreign governments, for example. We can get updated figures from a foreign government that will show that a situation in a particular country has rapidly evolved and rapidly changed. And that's why we'd have to move at a really quick pace. So that's why we have that's why we've taken the approach that we've taken. You've obviously referenced the fact that this committee will scrutinise those amendments, and there is that window whereby they can choose to approve the regulations. If there is something that we can do to further enhance Parliament's scrutiny of these regulations, then I have no issue with that. I'm happy to engage, be it the committee in that, or indeed the presiding officer in the Parliament. But we are moving at a pace because of the rapidly evolving situation in various other countries. But I'm happy to keep our engagement with Parliament under very constant review.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and that's appreciated. And clearly, the requirement to provide information the committee asks for is fundamental to the relationship between Parliament and government. Clearly, if government chooses to supply some of that information on a confidential basis, that can be agreed between us. I think Emma Harper wanted to clarify the point she was asking. I think it's not numbers so much as knowing which people are coming from non-exempt countries by means other than air. Emma Harper.
Thanks, Convener. I know, Cabinet Secretary, the numbers will fluctuate, so I'm not really seeking accurate numbers of people coming into the country. Just the security of completing forms and the passenger locator forms and the accuracy. That was the assurance that I was seeking, not necessarily the numbers, because I know numbers will fluctuate.
So, Cabinet Secretary, essentially, can you confirm that you're able to identify everyone travelling by ferry or by other?
I lost you, Convener.
Following Emma Harper's point, it's not so much the numbers she was after as to be secure in the knowledge that people are completing forms in an appropriate. That's something you can assure the committee of today.
Sure. Again, you'll forgive me, Convener, I'm not sure if it's my connection or yours, but yes, I refer to my answer that I gave previously to Emma Harper that, of course, people should be filling out the appropriate forms, whether they're coming in via ferry or whether they're coming in via air, and of course, Border Force at the ports would, of course, check a sample of those forms. Rachel Sutherland, who might be online, may well have more to add potentially to that particular question.
Rachel Sutherland.
Yeah, happy to say a little bit more. So in essence, the rules are that it doesn't matter which way you come into the country, or indeed whether or not you come in via a point of entry elsewhere in the UK, you are caught by the regulations based upon your place of self-isolation. And Border Force and Home Office should be sharing the data with us based upon the addresses that individuals are inputting. So therefore, it should not be the case that people who come in to into Scotland having entered via a port elsewhere in the UK or an airport would not be caught. So it can give you an assurance from a policy perspective that that is what is happening.
Thank you very much. Clearly, we're also keen to understand from a practical implementation purpose that the policy is followed through, but I'm sure that's something on which the Cabinet Secretary can write to the committee to confirm. Can I now call David Thomas?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. My questions are around health protection, coronavirus, international travel, Scotland Amendment number 3, Regulation 2020. Cabinet Secretary, why was it considered these regulations required to be introduced urgently?
Cabinet Secretary.
I suppose it's just, as members will be aware, because of the low prevalence point of the virus here in Scotland, the risk of inbound transmission and the imputation of the virus from out with Scotland was a risk that was one that became quite urgent, and therefore it was agreed by all 4 nations to take that urgent action at the time. So we've been pushing for some kind of controls at the border for a fair bit of time, but ultimately we wanted to do so on a 4 nations basis. I think for all the obvious reasons it would make sense to do so when it comes to our borders. So yes, essentially because the community transmission was so low in Scotland and the prevalence was so low in Scotland, the risk from inbound transmission clearly was a greater risk.
David Thomas.
The provision of information on countries people have previously visited prior to arrival in Scotland. What the practical effect of this provision of this information in the passenger locator form provide?
Cabinet Secretary.
So again, I maybe it's my connection there, but if I understood you correctly, did you ask me about information that people provide from a non-exempt country?
No, it's the information collected on prior to people have visited prior to arriving in Scotland. What practical effect will this provision of this information in the passenger locator form provide?
Cabinet Secretary.
So first of all, every single person who should be quarantining will receive an email. So that information that's provided on the passenger locator form will help us to identify an email address. That email will be sent to every single person that should be quarantining, and it has about a 98.8% success rate of an email going through, so that's helpful for that. Border Force then sample check, and their sample check of passenger locator forms is quite high. And then, of course, as we've already discussed, the sample will then be followed up by Public Health Scotland. And again, if they are unable to get through to somebody after a number of attempts and have reasonable suspicion around their quarantining activity or the information provided, they can provide that information to Police Scotland. So all of that information from the passenger locator form is hugely important.
David Thomas.
Thank you, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, in your previous answer, you said that the police role would be reactive instead of proactive. How will we enforce these with people coming from countries which have enforced restrictions on?
Cabinet Secretary.
So again, I just go back to my previous answers. Police Scotland throughout the pandemic have taken a 4 E's approach. They'll engage, they'll educate, they'll encourage, and as a last resort, they'll enforce. But they'll either have those contacts passed on to them from Public Health Scotland, as we've already discussed, or indeed they may come across people from third-party reporting. Somebody knows their neighbours come back from Spain, they should be quarantining, aren't quarantining. They may well call Police Scotland to follow up, or indeed Police Scotland might come across somebody in the normal course of duty. So there's a range of ways that Police Scotland may well come in contact with somebody.
Thank you very much. I now call Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to the Cabinet Secretary and other people on the call. Can I discuss business and regulatory impact assessments and equalities impact assessments for these regulations? Can I ask Cabinet Secretary firstly why these haven't been published, and is it your intention for them to be published, and when will this happen?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the BRIA has been published, and we can send detail of that, and the equalities impact assessment will follow, I would hope, for later this week. It shouldn't be any later than the end of this week. And again, we can send that on to the committee via the convener.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. I'm going to ask here what the rationale was behind business regulatory and equalities impact behind exempting elite sports people from the requirement to quarantine and provide information in passenger locator form. Obviously, I have an interest in this specifically.
Yeah, obviously I recognise Brian Whittle's particular interest. I think it is an important question. Elite sports and Scotland's ability to host elite sporting events is, of course, has an economic impact, but particularly for parts of rural Scotland. If I took in particular golf, and that is probably the sector that has benefited thus far the most from the elite sport exemption, although football in terms of Champions League or Europa would also be captured, and we saw Glasgow City Football Club taking part in a Champions League match just a number of days ago. But primarily golf will benefit from that, even for events that are held as they are in closed doors. They do have a direct economic benefit. They show that Scotland's still open. The local economy will benefit from that. But ultimately, actually, if we didn't have these exemptions, then we could lose those events from Scotland, obviously, not just for now, but for it could damage Scotland's reputation generally as a place for elite sport. So I think there's a number of good reasons why that exemption was brought forward, a number of economic reasons as well. But the exemptions are there, but there's very firm guidance that has to be followed in relation to those exemptions to minimise any risk of inbound transmission.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I do recognise that, Cabinet Secretary. Obviously, we just had the Women's Open Golf down at my hometown in Troon, which was obviously great to see. But I'm looking here at, we obviously have international elite athletes travelling abroad. We've had, again, I'm going to mention my sport, some fantastic results from Laura Muir, Gemma Reiki and Jake Whiteman. They're travelling around Europe, competing in these competitions, again under restrictions. How is that being managed? That risk assessment being managed because they're obviously not being required to quarantine.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, so they have to follow though some pretty firm guidance that we have already. So for the sector, there was some guidance that was developed for elite sports people in terms of what they would have to do when they're travelling between countries and indeed coming back to Scotland. I don't know whether that guidance is public, but I would see no issue in it necessarily being so. I'm just looking at it at the moment. So if I can take that away and we can send the guidance onto the committee if they want to have a look at that. But that guidance. I think it might be on the website actually. Yes, it is actually. Sorry, I'm just looking at my detailed information here. So Sport Scotland were consulted and they co-produced the guidance, which is hosted on their website. So I'm sure we could either send the link or the link could be found by your committee clerks. But there is a guidance that has been produced, which hopefully will help to minimise the risk to elite sports people themselves, but also of them bringing the virus back into the country.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I think it's quite interesting. There have been a number of international athletes at these meetings that have discovered that they have coronavirus because obviously they're pre-tested before they're allowed to compete. So there are upsides to it, I think. One of the things that I was interested in is how you're defining an elite athlete, and it says here is one who derives a living from competing in sport. I'm really interested to see how you came to that, because I know an awful lot of elite athletes who are in sport who don't make a living from sport. So why is that specific definition come to the fore here, Cabinet Secretary?
Cabinet Secretary.
So the reference that Brian Whittle makes to deriving a living from competing in sport, that's just one of the criteria. And again, I can furnish the committee with other criteria, but other criteria would be, for example, they have to be quote unquote a senior representative nominated by a relevant sporting body. They have to quote unquote as a member of the senior training squad for a relevant sporting body, or quote unquote as age 16 or above on an elite development pathway. And that actually matches the definition in the guidance governing the return of high performance elite sport, and it's designed to cover all performance and professional athletes. I haven't been made aware thus far from Sport Scotland or indeed anybody else that the definition is particularly restrictive. But if there are concerns, then again, of course, that could be explored.
Right.
Yes, thank you. And finally, I think I was going to move on to film and television and the rationale behind exempting those involved in film and definition. And I think, again, how that is being defined is of high end, the definition of high end in these circumstances, which seems to me, Cabinet Secretary, a very open-ended, non-specific way of describing that. So what's the rationale behind film and television, and could you help us with the definition of high end, why that's been put forward?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, as somebody who hasn't previously been involved in television production, I asked in the beginning of these, when we laid these regulations, or before we laid these regulations, that exact question. I think it's a very good one around the definition of what is high-end TV production. So high-end TV production is defined as a television programme, which is a British programme for the purposes of Part 15A of the Corporation Tax Act 2009, Section B. The definition states the programme must be a drama, documentary or animation. The slot length, i.e. the period of time which the programme is commissioned to fill, is greater than 30 minutes. The average core expenditure, including pre-production and post-production per hour of slot length, is greater than £1 million. Again, if committee needed more detail on that, we're happy to, but in essence, it relates to the Part 15A of the Corporation Tax Act 2009.
Thank you very much. The Cabinet Secretary, I note you mentioned the business and regulatory assessment has been completed. Advise the BRIA for these regulations, not yet on the Scottish Government website, but I'm sure that's something you will attend to after this meeting. Can I now call Sandra White?
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and the officials there also. I'm following on from the travel regulations, as was mentioned by my colleague earlier on. The first question I want to ask is more or less a generalisation question. Now, the legislation says that 14 days is sufficient time to conclude someone does not have COVID-19. But if they do have the virus, this is a general question, is a 14-day period in an exempt country prior to their arrival in Scotland sufficient time to be certain they're no longer infectious and warrant exemption from quarantine rules?
Cabinet Secretary.
So if they're travelling from an exempt country, the reason that country would be exempt is because we've taken, hopefully on a four nations basis, but we've taken a decision based on a variety of data that we've received from the Joint Biosecurity Centre, but also from Public Health England, that the risk of the virus and inbound transmission is really, really low. In some cases, the countries that are on the exempt list, their prevalence point will be lower than Scotland's, lower than England's, for example, and therefore we would judge that risk to be low risk or indeed medium risk, but certainly not high risk. So the 14-day period would be sufficient, but I would add two maybe caveats to that. One, airlines know that if somebody is displaying symptoms, they should not be allowing them to travel. So if somebody did begin to display symptoms just as they were leaving an exempt country, they should not be allowed to travel. And of course, if somebody develops symptoms in the course of travel, or even after they've travelled and arrived back in the country, they should obviously follow the guidance as per booking a test immediately and then self-isolating, and the rest of the household self-isolating too.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, for that. The clarification I did seek there was the fact that it's a four-nation approach, so I thank you very much for that. The next question I wanted to ask was it's regarding emergency powers to make regulations. Now, the convener has already mentioned emergency powers, as had previous colleagues as well, basically to ensure that restrictions are in place for those travelling to Scotland, minimised as far as possible any risks. Can you tell me what makes the addition of a country to the exempt list a matter requiring the use of emergency health powers And I noticed in an answer to, I think it was Emma Harper, you mentioned the four-nation approach as well. Is that part of the decision to bring forward emergency public health powers in Scotland? Is it a four-nation approach too?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the latter part of our question, it's for each government to determine how they bring forward regulations. My understanding is because we often make these decisions. For example, the last decision that we made as a four nations on a four nations basis, we agreed that we'd announce the decision that day and we'd implement. I think, if I remember correctly, 48 hours later. But each laying of the regulations is the responsibility of the Northern Irish, Welsh, UK, and Scottish governments individually. But I would imagine, because of that very short time frame between decision and implementation, that they also probably rely on some element of emergency power. But I would have to double check that with the Welsh, Northern Irish, and the UK government. But I suspect that they do rely on some emergency or expedited procedure. In terms of the substance of our question around why use emergency powers for adding a country to the exempt list, what's the urgency in that? I suppose the way I look at it is asking people to quarantine for 14 days is a huge restriction on people's liberty. It's probably the biggest restriction on people's liberty that we could impose. And therefore, if we're able to remove that imposition and restriction, then we should do that as soon as it's practically safe to do so. I suppose the other point would be that there's also pressures that we know from an industry under real challenge, the aviation industry and the tourism industry. And therefore, again, if we can move quickly because we know it's safe to do so, then I think it's right that we take that course of action as quickly as we possibly can.
Thank you. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. It sort of brings me neatly on to my third question, maybe my last question, but I may have a follow-up to it. The policy memorandum lists stakeholders as Police Scotland, COPS, Border Force in Scotland, Public Health Scotland, and key airports in Scotland. Can you tell me, I know there's been discussions ongoing, can you tell me what the outcome has been in regards to those discussions with these stakeholders, and in particular airports, in regard of the impact of introducing measures at short notice in airports?
Yeah. So we keep Police Scotland and the Crown updated on the amendments right throughout discussions. So my officials will talk to Police Scotland officials, COPFS officials, right throughout the discussions that we have. We'll share often the news releases with them and the regulations when they're available. As you know, as I've already referenced to David Stewart, I have a weekly call with Police Scotland. We'll often talk about COVID legislation in that regard. She mentions airports in Scotland. Again, it'd be fair to say that the aviation industry, they do express concerns at the quarantine requirements for passengers that arrive in the UK, not just in Scotland, but I think their central concern has been what they would term as a kind of blanket approach to quarantine. So they would like to see a more regionalised approach that may take into account, the data from the Balearics, for example, or indeed other regions, but potentially, mainly from islands. So they've been concerned about that. I'm not opposed to that approach. I have to say I'm not opposed to looking at a more regional approach, but I'd only do so when we had confidence from the Joint Biosecurity Centre and others that the data we were receiving gave us a confidence to be able to do that. And I just don't have that data from a regional kind of island perspective in particular. So the conversations have continued with airports, but it'd be fair to say that they express a fair degree of reservation about the approach that's taken.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. It's certainly, constituents, and I'm sure all of us here have had concerns raised in regards to areas like Mallorca, Ibiza, which have no COVID-19, and yet there are restrictions on them. So I just wonder how far we can go in that respect in the regional process, or each nation state rather than a four-nation approach. If I could, this would be my last question. I just wanted to ask on behalf of myself and many others who have asked me this, why is it that there's no legislation or guidelines in regards to social distancing on aeroplanes seated?
Cabinet Secretary.
So again, there is guidance for the aviation sector in relation to passengers. For example, if an airline was taking if a particular plane was taking a route where they were stopping in an exempt country and then a non-exempt country, for example, how the passengers would be managed in that regard. So there is guidance that's there. Essentially, though, if people are travelling from a non-exempt country, then you would think they almost act as one social bubble in one sense, because they're all travelling from that non-exempt country, and therefore there's perhaps a minimising of the risk there. But look, if there's more that can be done by my colleague, the Transport Secretary, in his discussions with the aviation industry, I know it's a conversation he has on a very regular basis, both with the airlines and the airports, then I'm sure he'd the member or indeed the committee directly. But there is guidance, it would be fair to say, there is guidance there for the aviation sector.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was hoping we'd follow that up. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much. I now call Donald Cameron.
Thank you. I was going to ask about Spain, Cabinet Secretary. Spain is obviously a country that was added to the list, to the exempt list, and then removed. Can I first ask on what basis Spain was added to the exempt list, please?
So the member will probably be aware the UK government owns the data, and therefore I'm not able to share the exact data or all of the data related to individual countries. I have asked the UK government to publish the data. I think it would be a good thing to do. I know the Welsh government have done similarly, and I know, in fairness to the UK government, they tell me they are supportive of that, and they're looking at a way and a means of doing that. But in reference to his question, if I speak in perhaps slightly more general, when it came to Spain, the point at which we took the decision to put them on the exempt list, their point prevalence was an equivalent level to Scotland's. And that wasn't the case in the prior weeks. The point prevalence rate was significantly higher than Scotland's. He would be, at that point though, when we made the exemptions, it would be right to say that we'd begun to see a couple of outbreaks in a couple of regions in Spain, but we were certainly under the impression, again from the information that we were receiving, that those outbreaks were being carefully managed. Of course, the situation moved very rapidly, and we got updated data which showed the number of new cases in Spain, but I think most worryingly showed that the increase in the new cases wasn't restricted to just one or two regions of Spain, as we previously thought, but the vast majority of regions in Spain, which meant that which is why we took the decision on the 26th to remove Spain.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
You touched on this, Cabinet Secretary, in an answer just before I asked you my last question. But some commentary suggested that a distinction can be drawn between the Spanish mainland and the Spanish islands. The Spanish islands, whether it's the Balearics or the Canaries, are popular holiday destinations. Is it feasible to take a regional approach like that, first of all? And are you actively considering, in particular in relation to Spain, that kind of distinction?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it is a really good question, and he knows that the government has generally taken quite a cautious approach to the pandemic, and people will criticise that, and I understand that. But as I've often said, I'd rather be criticised perhaps for being a bit too cautious than being too cavalier. And for me, the data that I've seen thus far wouldn't give me confidence to take a more regionalised approach, because what we don't have data on, for example, or enough confidence in the data, is if I took the Balearics and Canaries that he references, what is the travel between the mainland of Spain and those islands, and how sure can we be and how confident can we be around the measures of potential inbound transmission from the mainland of Spain into the Canaries, for talking sake. And I just don't have that confidence in the data. The second part of this question, yes, there would absolutely be a willingness to explore such an approach, but as I say, we'd first have to ensure that we had confidence in the robustness of the regional data. That would allow the JBC, the Joint Biosecurity Centre, to make a separate risk assessment for that region. And as I say, we'd also have to have confidence about the travel between the mainland and the islands.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to Donald Cameron in a moment, but I have a brief supplementary from Willie Rennie. Willie Rennie.
Yeah, Cabinet Secretary, I was surprised when you lifted the quarantine measures on Spain only to impose them a few days later, because the incident rate was on the rise in Spain. But the First Minister did say she would look at measures around about compensation for those people who left the country to go to Spain on the basis that there wouldn't be a quarantine. But I didn't actually see the conclusion of that consideration. Is there any conclusion on this?
There won't be any compensation paid to people who may have booked a holiday to travel and then decided to cancel. Obviously, they would be able to take that up with their insurance company, and also based on the changing FCO advice that accompanied the change that was made. But I think time and time again, the First Minister and I have both been clear that there are risks with travelling internationally in the midst of a global pandemic, and I think I would reiterate that any country carries that risk, as safe as it may seem at the moment. And decisions made by government to exempt or not exempt, that could change, as we've seen, not just with Spain, but also with France. That could change with a very rapidly evolving situation. So there won't be certainly any compensation for those that travelled from the government, but of course they should be able to take that up with their insurer.
Thank you very much. Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. My final question is just about when you add a country to the exempt list, does that mean that over the preceding 14 days you are satisfied that the infection there is at a safe level? Is 14 days previous the time frame that you analyse?
Cabinet Secretary.
So depending on the country, it would be a minimum of that. It would be 2 weeks in some countries because of the prevalence of the virus. So again, I don't own this data, but I don't think there'd be anything necessarily wrong in me giving you some detail of one example. So Portugal, that we've recently added to the exempt list, we actually looked at what the data around that was for the preceding 4 weeks, just because of, again, the numbers that might travel from Portugal and the high numbers that may travel from Portugal. So yes, 2 weeks in the general would be the period that we'd look at. But there's also a range of other measures. For example, we'd also look at what measures a foreign government is taking in relation to tackling the virus. So again, if the numbers of cases were rising, but the government was not restricting, was not imposing any particular restrictions, or was not increasing any of the measures around virus control, then that would also give us cause for concern. So he's right, 14 days is absolutely, we would absolutely look at the preceding 14 days, but it's just one of the measures that we'd look at.
Thank you very much. I call George Adam.
Good morning, and thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I would just like to ask a question on the back of what's already been said by Donald Cameron beforehand. Cabinet Secretary, what would be the process for a nation to be removed from the exempt list? Can you maybe talk me through how you would go through that and how, because I've got quite a lot of business people, in particular in my constituency in Paisley, who have business interests in Spain, and this is causing them a bit of a problem at the moment. So what would be the process for you actually taking a nation off the exempt list?
Cabinet Secretary.
So first and foremost, we'll look at the data that's presented to us. So we'll look at the JBC data, we'll look at things like the point prevalence, we'll look at the increase of new cases, we'll look at the percentage of the test positivity ratio. We'll look at, as I say, a whole range of data that we can possibly gather. We'll then also look at the risk analysis that's been done of each country, which will go into some of the detail I've mentioned already, but we'll also look at things like I've said around the government's handling of the virus, and we'll take all of that data in the round, and then we'll make a decision, hopefully on a 4 nations basis. And largely we've been aligned. There was one difference most recently in relation to Switzerland, which is not part of these amendments, but perhaps amendments I'll speak to another time. But we will honestly look at the data in the round. We'll look at a whole range of data, and then we'll make our best judgment, often on a cautious basis, because Scotland's prevalence of the virus is so low, and therefore the risk of inbound transmission can be fairly high.
George.
Cabinet Secretary, thanks for that. One of the things that I'll be asked by, and it follows on from what Donald Cameron said previously, is, they'll say that there's certain parts of Spain where, in the region, it's a large country, there's a low prevalence of the virus, and they think they should be able to go. Now, don't get me wrong, they want to do it because they have business interests there and they want to go across and deal with that. But when you look at that, are we able to work in some kind of regional basis when we do look at taking somebody off the exempt list? Can we look at various, okay, you've got the islands and the mainlands, and you've already told us that it might be because of interaction between the two that might be the issue. But is there a way we could look at it in a regional way? And I'm talking purely from people that have got business interests in some of these nations that are on the exempt list.
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't know if I can add really more to what I've said, other than I'm definitely sympathetic to it, and I would say, without speaking for the other governments of the UK, I think every one of us have expressed some sympathy with that argument, and I see the rationality for it and the rational basis for it. But we do have to look at things like the robustness of the data that we get in relation to those regions, the travel between the mainland and those islands in this case, but also those regions if they're not islands. And also, I suppose the third thing we'd have to take into account is, if we took that approach for, say, Spain, we'd have to then take that approach for every single other country that also has islands. And would we have the same confidence in those countries' data? Probably not, but we'd have to do that for every other country on a consistent basis as well, and that can be quite challenging.
George.
No, thank you, Convener, that's me.
Thanks very much. Just very briefly on that point, Cabinet Secretary, can you tell us how many travellers from Spain entered Scotland during the 2 or 3 days when Spain was not required, when travellers from Spain were not required to quarantine? How many entered, how many were contacted, and what followed? So
the numbers contacted were around 900. Sorry, the numbers that arrived in were around about 950. It was 944. I'm just trying to look for the exact figure, but it was around 950. They wouldn't have been contacted because they were exempt from travelling, so they would have had to obviously fill out the passenger locator form. They will have known that, of course, if they became symptomatic, they would have to book a test and self-isolate. But because they were not part of the quarantining measures, they wouldn't be in that sample that would then be contacted.
Okay, thank you very much. And finally, before we move to the debate, I guess some of what we've heard today, in terms of your answers to questions, has been around low levels of enforcement for reasons which you've explained very fully and which we understand. I guess the question that raises, though, is if this is emergency legislation, but there's not felt to be a need or a priority in checking on all those who should be quarantining to who they are, or in the level of contacts and tracing and so on. Does that have any bearing in your mind? And I appreciate your offer to consider how much further the Scottish Parliament could scrutinise these regs, but does this have any bearing on the emergency nature of these regulations?
Again, I will reflect on what the convener you suggest. I wouldn't want you to think that because Police Scotland's approach to this is reactive, that means that the quarantine measures are not important. They are. There's similar to, for example, licensed premises. Police Scotland officers won't go into every single licensed premises in Scotland to check whether they're complying on a Friday and Saturday night. But of course, if they have evidence to suggest that there's any concerns, or indeed in their routine course of business, they spot any breaches, then of course they may well look to take some action, which would again be on the 4Es basis. So Police Scotland's general approach, I think, has been to take a common sense approach to regulations. But in terms of the emergency nature of them, because situations can change in country so quickly, I do think it's important to bring them forward with this urgency. But if there's a further step that we could add into the process whereby Parliament could scrutinise them to a greater degree, or I could come to committee on a more regular basis, then that's not something that I would have any qualms with.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. That's appreciated, and clearly that's for another day. For today, we now move on to agenda items 3 to 8 inclusive, the formal debates on the made affirmative SSIs on which we have just taken evidence. Are members content that we should hold a single debate to cover all of the instruments in question? I see no dissent, and therefore I think we are agreed to proceed on that basis. Can I remind members and others that we are now, because we are moving to a debate stage, members do not put questions to the Minister during the formal debate stage. Officials do not contribute to the debate. This is like a different and a more formal stage. Can I now invite the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move motions S5M 22258, S5M 22460, and numbers S5M 22463 to S5M 22466 inclusive, all in the name of Jean Freeman. Secretary.
Well, considering that you're short for time, and I know you have a lot on your agenda, we've covered a fair bit of ground. Happy to do away with speaking to each of the amendments, because I think committee has gone through the issues in great detail. I'm just happy to move the following motions: motion S5M 22258 in Jean Freeman's name, motion S5M 22460 in my own name, S5M 22463 in my name, S5M 22464 in my name, S5M 22465 in my name, and S5M 22466 in my name. Are happy to move those amendments, those motions.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Are there any members who wish to contribute to the debate, having had the evidence session? I see no indications of contributions. Are members content then that a single vote be held on these 6 motions? Members appear to be so content. I therefore put a single question. The question is that motions S5M 22258, 22460 and 22463 to 22468 inclusive be approved. Are we all agreed? We are so agreed, and the decision therefore is that those motions are now passed. Thank you very much, and can I thank the Cabinet Secretary and his officials for their attendance this morning and for answers to a very wide range of questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We now move on to the 9th item on our agenda. That is that the evidence session with the Care Inspectorate, which is one of a series of evidence sessions we have been holding with health and care bodies, which will also contribute to our 2021-2022 budget scrutiny. The committee's approach to scrutiny of the budget reflects the approach recommended by the Budget Process Review Group. It entails addressing budget implications throughout the year and bringing this information together to inform a pre-budget report for consideration by the Cabinet Secretary. This year, the committee has agreed to undertake pre-budget scrutiny of the 2021-22 budget, while also considering the impact on health and social care of COVID-19 as far as the current year's settlement is concerned. And in this meeting, we will be hearing from the Care Inspectorate on their work, including their budget, as well as work in relation to the statutory roles and the impact and implications of COVID-19 for the work. Can I therefore welcome to the committee Peter MacLeod, Chief Executive of the Care Inspectorate, and Kevin Mitchell, Executive Director of Scrutiny and Insurance at the Care Inspectorate. We will move straight to questions. I will begin, and then we will ask colleagues in the usual way to put a number of questions and invite Peter MacLeod and Kevin Mitchell to respond. Can I begin by asking the Care Inspectorate to address their statutory brief as set out in Part 5 of the Public Services Reform Act 2010, which is to protect the users of social care services, to encourage a diversity of services, to promote the independence of users of care services, and to identify and promote good practice in social care. Can I put it to Mr. MacLeod, how effectively is the Care Inspectorate fulfilling those purposes? Peter MacLeod.
Thank you, Convener, for asking me to address that question. Just before I do so, could I just put on the record my acknowledgement, Convener, for the loss and the tragedy that has occurred as a result of the impact of COVID-19 in Scotland. And of course, within the care sector, there has been loss of life. There are many bereaved and grieving families. And indeed, that is also the case for staff members who have worked selflessly and have also lost their lives. And I really feel it would be important for me, given my role in the Care Inspectorate, to acknowledge that tragedy and the impact it has. It's something I very much is heartfelt for me, having spent 30 years in the sector and having come to this role in the last 18 months. And it must remain a focal point and something that drives us forward to change and learn. So I did want to put that on record, Convener, and I hope that's acceptable to you. In terms of the Public Services Reform Act 2010 that you referred to, and indeed you outline the key responsibilities that we have, you will, I think, be clear, as many members are, that within the scope of that Act, there are a number of responsibilities, powers and duties that the Care Inspectorate have. And those range from the ability to register services, so to give the final say to a service being created in the first place. And that ranges from childminding services right through to care homes for adults and older people. We also have the power and duty in relation to inspection, and that is something we will no doubt return to again this morning. And we also have a number of powers that we can take forward around the cancellation of registration, conditions and variations to it, and indeed the improvement and enforcement activities that we can be involved in, and that is right up to cancellation of a service and therefore the closure of it. So I believe that the statutory underpinning of the Care Inspectorate does allow us to fulfil the full range of functions. Of course, I would be absolutely wishing to acknowledge that the unprecedented situation that COVID-19 has presented, not least in Scotland's care homes, has led us to continue to reflect with Scottish Government and other partners as to whether more should be done or changes should be made to some of the legislative requirements and powers that I have outlined.
Thank you very much. Clearly there have already been changes since 2010 to the requirements. For example, oversight of strategic commissioning and planning is now a responsibility of the Inspector. Can you tell us in that case and other cases of changes that have already been made to your remit over the last 10 years, how they have impacted upon the organisation?
My view is that they have impacted positively on the organisation. My background, part of my career was as a director of social work, so that whole area of commissioning and the examination of services at a local partnership level around commissioning and indeed integrated services is, in my view, critical. We have completed 8 such inspections over recent years. If your question is what impact in the context of this committee those have had on our budgetary and resource availability, we have in fact received some additional resource through business cases we have made to Scottish Government for specific requirements. So, for example, the expansion of early learning and childcare, some resource in relation to justice services, etc. And more recently, we've received additional resource in recent weeks to do with increasing the capacity of our inspector workforce and the numbers within it and recruiting to vacancies. So I believe that we've had responsive support in a resourcing sense, and that has enabled us to focus on priority areas of risk.
Clearly, in addition to the funding you receive from the Scottish Government, you also have direct income, and an important budget question, I guess, is whether the balance of government funding and direct income is working, whether it's right or about right, and whether there are opportunities to increase the level of direct income to offset increasing demands on government funding.
The proportion is 1/3 of income generated to 2/3 grant and aid from Scottish Government and the Parliament. The almost £12 million is generated from registered services fees, and those can be up to £13,500 a year for a large care home service, for example, convener. One of the actions that we've been taking forward with Scottish Government officials at this point in time is not just a review of potentially the level of fees, but also the definitions of services, because I believe that those require to be updated to reflect the current picture of services in Scotland. Of course, one of the dilemmas in that regard in terms of fees raised is how much those impact on services that potentially could be already quite stretched in the social care sector. So there is a fine balance to be struck, and indeed during the COVID-19 crisis, one of the things that we did very early was we deferred fees collection across the sector that we regulate in order to relieve some of the burdens for services that were clearly already struggling under the demands that COVID brought to them.
Thank you very much. And I now call David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to Mr MacLeod and Mr Mitchell. There has been a marked decline in inspections of care homes for adults over the last 5 years. Why is that?
Peter MacLeod.
We inspect, Mr Stewart, and in particular we changed the methodologies of inspection back in 2014-15 to have a much more outcome focus to the way that we inspect, to look at not just the sizes of rooms or other, if you like, more kind of straightforward requirements of services, but also the experience of those living in those services, the relationships that they had to support them, and that those services were responsive to their needs and the outcomes that we all sought for the individuals concerned. I think, though, it would be correct to say that we also have developed increasingly an intelligence-led model of inspection. And that means that we target our inspections very rigorously at those services that most need to be looked at and where we believe that improvement is most urgently needed. So despite the fact that there have been some reductions in the numbers of inspections carried out over the last number of years, I would point to the fact, for example, that over the 3 years up to 2019, because of that targeting and that very clearly risk-aware approach to what we were doing with inspection, we actually had to, unfortunately, take an action to close 9 care services in Scotland through the powers that I mentioned earlier on to the convener through the Sheriff Courts. So I believe that we are proportionate in what we do, but we are targeting the right services in terms of those that require inspections out with the statutory inspections that we need to undertake in any case.
David Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Could I also move on to return inspections? Again, over the last 5 years, the number of return inspections also fell dramatically. Is it the same reasons that Mr MacLeod made earlier, or why is this?
Peter MacLeod.
Thanks very much. The number of return inspections are determined by the improvements that we find are required to be put in place, Mr Stewart. And what we have, because we have targeted in a much more risk-aware way and much more towards those services in most need, we have been able to deal with matters very quickly. I've mentioned some of the cancellations of registration, for example. But we also have a number of services that won't necessarily be inspection continuation or follow-on visits, for example, from our improvement team. So that much more of our focus in the last number of years has been and how we have built resources around improvement services. And that's so that services that maybe are experiencing difficulty, we can assist them to improve before we need to enforce action against them, because the enforcement of action often is based on a risk to individuals. We would prefer to be preventative and improving in our approaches with services. So there's a mix of reasons, but that is one principal reason for the decline in the number of continued or repeat visits.
Thank you, Convener. Mr MacLeod, what specific monitoring was carried out to residents discharged hospital during the COVID-19 pandemic to homes, particularly to homes with poor inspection reports?
Peter MacLeod.
Thanks, Mr Stewart. Thanks, Convener. What I would say in relation to the issue of discharge from hospital, and I return again to the fact that I have long experience in the social care sector. I'm former director of social work, and I believe, as you will be aware, that there is a very clear and defined process for how the decision is reached at for somebody to be discharged from hospital. That will involve a clinical judgment by a medical person within the hospital setting that somebody is ready to leave hospital. There will be a view taken by the Health and Social Care Partnership in assessing the needs of the individual, that they should be placed, for example, in a care home. And I think critically, the care home requires to ensure that they are equipped to deal with the individual's needs and then make the decision to admit or accept their care. In terms of our role within that regard, Mr Stewart, our role is to ensure that we provide proper guidance and direction to services about particularly infection prevention and control practice. And beyond that, in terms of the grading relationship, that is not something that we are directly involved in. That would be a matter for the partnership and the care service, alongside the hospital service, to make a determination of where it is that the individual is best placed. I am, of course, aware that the Cabinet Secretary for Health and Sport has recently commissioned Public Health Scotland to examine a number of cases of individuals that were discharged from hospital into care homes. And I await the examination and the findings of it and any further learning and actions that will emerge from it.
Thank you, Kevin. I won't drag Mr MacLeod into any political controversy, but clearly there was a government move to clear hospitals of patients and put them to care homes during the COVID pandemic. And obviously we've had some recent coverage in the Sunday Post about this. What was the Care Inspectorate brought into discussions about pandemic planning and the effect this would have on our care homes, who are obviously under quite a lot of pressure, particularly these care homes that had poor inspection reports? I mean, were you given discussion? Did you give advice, guidance and assistance to the Scottish Government about that decision? I do understand the issue about clinical decisions, but in the end of the day, there was a wider macro Scottish Government decision to clear hospitals and to move patients to care homes.
Thanks, Mr. Stewart. Obviously, I'm aware of the debate around that and clearly the impact that such decisions could have taken. I suppose I would repeat again that our role as the regulator for Scotland for care services is to advise and provide the right guidance along with Health Protection Scotland and others in the face of this unprecedented public health crisis. It is not our role to advise in relation to decisions around the discharge of patients from hospital. I think I've made it clear in my earlier answer that is actually a matter for the local area on a case by individual case basis. So that is not something that is a role, advisory or other, that we have stepped into to answer your question, and it would be a matter for others to make a determination of how these matters were progressing. Clearly, with the announcement by the First Minister of Scotland or a future public inquiry in relation to COVID-19 and its impact on Scotland, we await and will clearly be advised by the findings of it, particularly in relation to the question that you posed to me.
Thank you. And finally, Convener, could you explain the self-assessment process? And presumably, process does provide feedback from residents to drive improvements in care homes in the future.
Peter MacLeod.
Thank you. The self-assessment process is there just as you describe it. It's there to give a sense of the service itself, where they think they are performing, and more particularly where they need to improve. But I think what's absolutely critical is that is only part of the picture, and indeed it does involve the seeking of views from those cared for and supported and relatives also. But equally, it is something that is one part of the picture, and it is also rigorously tested against the quality frameworks, the inspection regimes that we have in place and have modernised in Scotland. And therefore, one of the things that would be, I believe, wrong to do is to accept a self-assessment purely at face value. It is something that is an aid to the service and ourselves, but we rigorously inspect every aspect of care, every aspect of leadership management, resourcing and training, and indeed in recent times, the provision and suitability of infection prevention and control measures. So it is only one part of the picture that we build. And if we find through the building of that picture and through inspection interventions that things need to improve, we do not hesitate to take that forward and take appropriate action.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I bring in Emma Harper, I have a brief supplementary to Mr. Stewart's questions from Brian Whittle. Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. MacLeod. It's really around this phrase clinical judgment. We hear this phrase clinical judgment all the time, but correct me if I'm wrong here, but that's pertaining to the patient's health and the patient's ability to leave hospital. That clinical judgment from that clinician within the hospital does not take into account the potential impact of moving that patient into a setting like a care home. Would that be a fair assessment?
Peter McLeod.
Increasingly, and in my experience of this area of practice, those judgments are taken in the round. They look at the medical circumstances, but they equally look at the circumstances of the individual. So, for example, a judgment about whether, if well enough, that the person is able to go home. It may be that the home circumstances are not suitable or indeed safe for that to happen, and therefore a care setting is the best and determined option to be taken forward. I think I mentioned earlier on, Mr. Whittle, that there is a part of the process which requires an assessment by the health and care partnerships locally to ensure that the assessed need of the individual, it's an assessment which is determined in statute, in fact, is suitably done, and that the individual is therefore matched with the needs determined through that assessment. And in a sense, that's also another form of clinical judgment or assessment. And then thirdly, as I said, there is an assessment and judgment to be applied by the care home that the individual can be suitably cared for in their setting. They have adequate staff, they have adequate space, adequate nursing support, for example, should that be required. So I believe it in the round, given all the different parts of the process, should consider all of the individual's needs, not just the medical needs of that person at that given point in time.
Thank you very much. And I call on Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning to our witnesses this morning. Just to pick up on the issue of inspections and self-evaluation, are residents and their families involved in the self-evaluation process, and how is that feedback then received from the residents and the families used by inspectors to drive improvement?
Peter McLeod.
Thanks. It is indeed used as part of that self-evaluation process. I suppose I would repeat again that indeed that is part of the picture, and it is indeed part of what we use in the improvement process. But I think that what is even more critical is the questionnaires, the interviews, the groups of people being brought together, including relatives and staff members, that we would be progressing as part of an inspection programme. So what we're able to do is compare and contrast what the self-evaluation said against what our findings independently are. And I think we always recognise, and certainly in my experience running services like care at home services for many years, is that sometimes those receiving the service are more prone to saying everything's fine if you're asking the service provider. If you're making a comment to the inspectorate, you might have a slightly different view that you would want to share. And I think, therefore, it's part of the process, but it can never be the whole part of the process. And that's why the kind of processes that we put in place very robustly, and the conversations with relatives, those cared for and staff, is a critical part of how we find out what is going on in the service and the quality of care it provides.
Emma Harper.
I understand that the process of evaluation covers 6 and now 7 specific questions, and these questions are part of the self-assessment. So the questions, for instance, in this quality framework, look at supporting people's well-being, how good is leadership, how good is staff, how is the team, how good is our setting, and how is our care and support planned. And then the final question is a new question about care and support during the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, and as a nurse myself, I understand about the process of assessing care homes, but the self-assessment is something that is new to me. So I'm interested in how do we look at encouraging the self-assessment process in order to be robust, so that face-to-face inspection and the quality of the inspection marry up when we're doing self-assessment versus face-to-face.
I think there's a couple of ways that we would do that, and noting your past experience in nursing. I think that part of that is ensuring, first of all, that we developed our frameworks in conjunction with those in the sector, so that they owned and were part of how we shaped those. Indeed, we did the same with question 7, the new question, which focuses on infection prevention and control and related matters. We've also produced guides and guidance in terms of self-assessment. If you go onto our website, you'll find various resources around self-assessment. And in the recent year, up until lockdown, of course, and given my recent appointment in January last year with the Care Inspectorate, we have spent many days going round the country talking to care services very directly about the resources I referred to, how they should be used, how they tie into our quality frameworks, the 7 questions or 6 questions at that time that you referred to, and also encouraging people to undertake those self-assessments rigorously. So it is, as I say, part of the picture. I think, though, that just very briefly on question 7, there is an absolute criticality about question 7, which means that services do have to assess their robustness in terms of infection prevention and control. But in the midst of a pandemic such as this, that is what we most rigorously assess at this point in time. And clearly you'll see that as the focal point of our parliamentary reports every fortnight, and the fact that we do find concerns that we have to deal with, and we go back very quickly and we deal with those, and in the vast majority of cases they are then resolved, and we do that with public health, with nursing directors and other partners in the system.
Emma Harper.
Guidance and training that's given to inspectors in assessing the health and care standards. How do you provide guidance and training then for the inspectors so that there is consistency of inspections across Scotland? Is that something that is obviously you carry that out as well?
Yes, we do, but we also do it with partners. So, for example, in relation to infection prevention and control, we will do that with NHS Education Scotland. We'll also do that with the providers of services, much of that done over the past year. And that is absolutely, as you say, with the aim of achieving consistency around the way that services are inspected. I think that the way we've developed the quality frameworks, the questions you've referred to, mean that the consistency is I think, good, but equally there are judgments that need to be applied by individual inspectors. We've also introduced something in recent years called the Professional Development Awards. There are currently over 30 members of staff on that, and I think importantly we also have now a new involved Healthcare Improvement Scotland staff that do some joint inspections with us. So I believe all of that plus that new development programme is seeking to achieve the consistency and application that you mentioned.
Just a couple more quick questions. How are assessments fed back to the providers, and also how often are unannounced inspections made?
Thank you. The feedback from assessments, of course, are made, and what we do is that we give providers an opportunity to look at reports and draft and then comment on them, and then we publish them. So we may or may not accept the comments that they make based on the evidence that we find. But it is absolutely a process of dialogue with the service, including where things need to be done and need to be done very quickly. I think you asked me about follow-up visits. Is that what you asked me about? And if that's the case, you will see again, and I would reference the over 160 inspections that have taken place during our COVID-related inspections, and you'll see that there are a large number of those that have actually required follow-up visits. And clearly we have to take very, very quick action to ensure that those are addressed in the way that they should be. So that is an explanation of why those follow-up and continuation visits take place in the current context particularly.
Thank you very much.
I've got a final question, thank you. In the self-assessment process, how often do the services assess their own performance as poor or failing? Is that something that pops up now and again?
That's a very important question. I would need to go and, sorry, Camilla, I would need to go and absolutely check the detail of the numbers of those. I think that the answer is relatively rarely, but again, some of the self-assessment models we've introduced against the new standards are relatively new, and the sense I am getting from the providers in the sector is they're still moving towards a more accurate assessment of what they are finding for themselves. But I am often impressed with the honesty and the ability to reach out for assistance too from services. And I think that's a true hallmark of a service that is willing to learn and willing to deal with difficulty at the earliest stages. And I think I have been humbled on occasions through this public health crisis to see services coming forward, particularly around staffing, and saying we need help, and we have been able to assist them very directly and very quickly as a result of those requests.
Thank you very much. And I call David Torrance.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to our witnesses. My questions are around leadership and accountability in the future. How could the scrutiny landscape of health and care in Scotland be improved?
Thank you, Mr. Torrance. Thanks, Convener. I think that we always strive to improve, and I think through this COVID-19 public health crisis, we will require to reflect and consider and change even more. One of the reflections about how that landscape would change is how we can continue to work as closely as we have together during COVID. I would cite the example of care homes, the fact that we grouped round and wrapped round support to care homes in Scotland, Director of Public Health, Director of Nursing, the Care Inspectorate, Health and Care Partnerships, and providers, of course, working together to ensure that they were as well supported as possible. We developed, for example, something called the Safety Huddle tool, which is used now on a daily basis by the provider of service and the partnership to assess how matters are and how safe they are and how adequate care is, including staffing levels. I think, therefore, the landscape that I would suggest is the landscape of the future is one that is ever integrated in the interests of those that require care and support in Scotland. We are governed by the legislation that the convener introduced, and should it be the will of the Parliament to revisit that legislation to change the landscape of regulation, clearly we would be wishing to centrally contribute to that. But I think it's more integrated approaches. For example, we now inspect care services, care homes with Healthcare Improvement Scotland inspectors and public health personnel. That's the first time that has happened, but it's happened by necessity because of COVID-19.
David Torrance.
Has the shared vision and strategy 2015-20 been achieved, and what should be a focus for a strategy forum be for the next 5 to 10 years?
The shared vision and strategy, I think, has to a large degree had to be informed by the COVID-19 circumstances that we have faced. I believe that means that we have to stop, pause and reflect. So in relation to the Care Inspectorate's corporate plan, we are about to go back to our board with a refreshed view of where that should lie into the future by necessity. We cannot have the worst public health crisis in living memory and not then change what we do. Not least, Mr. Torrance, as I said at the beginning, of this committee, given the tragedy that we have seen unfolding within Scotland's care sector. So I believe we must reflect, must change. And I hope the submission I gave to today's committee shows you that we changed very rapidly, acted safely, and implemented very different systems. So we've already changed. I think we will change more and in a more integrated manner moving forward.
David Charles.
What is the role of the Office of the Chief Social Worker in relation to a care inspector, and how does she complement and add value to your work?
Peter MacLeod.
Thank you. The Office of the Chief Social Worker Advisor works very closely with the Care Inspectorate, and we very much complement the work that we do in our different functions. I know Iona Colvin very well. I meet with her on a regular basis, as do my senior leadership team members. We, in fact, during the COVID crisis, sit together on the leadership team for children and families for Scotland, and we deal with matters arising to do with social work and social care. We identify through our inspections, we share intelligence, and we deal with priority matters that require to be addressed and changed, including where risks have emerged in services. So I believe we work very closely and in a complementary way together across a whole range of functions in social work and social care.
David Charles.
Does the Care Inspectorate, given its multiple roles across such a range of services, have the capacity to lead the sector to a sustainable future?
Peter MacLeod.
Thank you. Yes, sorry. So I think that we do act as both the recipients and the collectors of information from our inspection activity across the range of functions to which you refer, and that is an invaluable source of exploring what is required for now and for the future. In terms of the sustainability of care, we already have a government programme and part of the leadership arrangements around that called the Reform of Adult Social Care. And in that regard, part of what it is examining are issues like fair work and resourcing and the current set of care services in place in Scotland. So we would be very well placed, and we would wish to advise and influence what it is that the future can hold for care services in Scotland. There are challenges within the sector which are well known, but there are also challenges that I see in my work across the British Isles and my work across Europe too. And I think we need to address those in the most practical way possible. But I leave you with this thought: we should address those in the way that it addresses the needs of individuals as they see the need for their supports to be addressed best by our services, not necessarily what we determine as what is best for them.
Thank you. David Charles.
Thank you, Convener. My final question: how does it demonstrate such leadership skills currently, and what are the essential elements of a sustainable care sector?
Peter MacLeod.
Thanks. I think our leadership role, and I have, as I referred to, over 30 years experience in the sector, my absolute commitment is to the care of people. That's what I've spent my life engaged in, and fortunately I have been able to influence, I think, to some degree, some of the changes positively that have occurred over the years too, in conjunction with talented people I've worked with. But I think that leadership role, again, in terms of sustainability, will mean that we have to look at all the options available to us in terms of the future of the care sector in Scotland. I do happen to believe that the home care sector is something that should be and requires to be a mainstay for Scotland's population in need of care and support. Equally, the measures that are put in place around the self-directed support legislation for Scotland, I think we can reflect again, they've been recently reviewed, at how they are promoted. But I think at the core of this is how we continue to integrate health and care services. I believe they should be further integrated with housing and with technology options in order to allow people to live as long as they can at home and safely and retain their independence where that is possible.
Thank you very much. And I call Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Mr MacLeod. My question is about integration and whether the joint inspections with Healthcare Improvement Scotland are just joint in name only, and because there's a point being made by some of our evidence that although there are joint inspections, there is different advice and approaches that flow from that. I also wonder whether the Care Inspectorate is visible enough at the integrated authority level, and therefore whether there is a truly joint approach.
Peter MacLeod.
Thank you. I believe there is a truly joint approach. I referred earlier to the 8 partnership inspections that we've taken place across Scotland. I would also want to cite the fact that I've recently developed a proposal which shared with partnerships and Scottish Government to change the way we do those joint inspections so they are much more focused on the experience and outcomes of the individuals that receive services from these partnerships. I do believe that we are focused often on the strategic and planning aspects, and that's what the Public Services Act put into place as part of the inspection duties placed upon us from integration. I think that we can broaden beyond that to look much more at the lived experience of those individuals receiving care and support, and whether that is suitable to their needs and can be improved upon. So I think in answer to your question, we are already changing, and we've engaged with partnerships already on the suggested changes that we are proposing to make. In terms of visibility, I think that is something that we always strive to, and I was equally interested in some of the comments given in evidence to this committee. But again, I don't think we're necessarily a champion for the sector. We are there to report on what we find within it without, frankly, fear or favour. And that also might mean that some of the things we say are not necessarily palatable because they require things to change, to improve, or to become safer. But I accept entirely that we can change and move forward in the way that you describe, Mr. Rennie, and visibility and profile is part of the new inspections that we propose on an integrated basis.
Willie Rennie.
I think that is helpful. I think you're acknowledging that some of the evidence that the committee has received is pertinent to the issues at play here. The fact that you're changing the inspection system and seeking more visibility is clearly a good thing. I suppose the next question I've got is around about the kind of viability, the sustainability of the sector. There is no doubt the pandemic may have quite a financial impact on an awful lot of social care businesses, and that those businesses may fail even though that the care they are providing is good quality. Do you have the expertise within your organisation to be able to provide support and advice on that kind of business failure or business success aspect, as well as the quality of the care? And if not, are you planning to change that? Because the climate's going to get an awful lot more difficult for these businesses, and we may need to have a greater focus on that.
I think, sorry, thanks, Convener. I believe that we have some of the expertise and capacity that's required, and I believe that we have already had some very active discussions. A paper that I am about to consider with my leadership team looks at something that in England is called market oversight. The Care Quality Commission, I work very closely with their chief executive and their senior officers, as I do with others in that position across the UK. After the failure of Southern Cross, Mr. Rennie, you may be aware of this, that legislation was laid that created that facility within the regulator in England. And therefore it is something that is an active discussion both within my organisation and with colleagues in Scottish Government. I accept that the current situation does impact on the sustainability of services, as you refer to, and we are actively exploring that kind of capacity within my organisation to make it more robust, and indeed working with bodies like Scotland Excel, COSLA, Scottish Care and others beyond that CCPS to ensure that we understand and can map the care sector and the vulnerabilities in it that relate to sustainability.
William.
Just on that point then, so if you're in discussions with the government on this, do you need more powers? Do you need new legislation in order to be able to carry out those functions that you've just described that are happening in England and you indicate might be necessary in Scotland? So do we need to put through new legislation?
Peter McLeod.
Thanks, Convener. I'm not sure that they necessarily need legislation. I believe that what they need is the ability to map and consider what is happening in the care sector. I think one reassurance that I would share with you is that where services, care providers operate both in Scotland and in England and across the UK, we have very close working relationships with regulators like the CQC that allow us to share information to provide that assessment. But in terms of further powers, I think that my considerations would not have reached a stage where I would be definitively saying to you today that more powers are required. But I certainly am considering what we need to do to undertake the work that we've discussed as a result of your question.
Thank you very much. I now call Donald Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. The Care Inspectorate obviously has a role in ensuring improvement in services and advising on them, but you also police care in Scotland with your inspection and enforcement role. And firstly, I suppose my question is, do you accept there is a tension between those two? And if so, how do you in practice resolve that tension?
It's a debate that, thank you, Convener. I will try and remember to let you come in. Apologies, Convener. Yes, I very much understand, Mr. Cameron, the tension you refer to between, if you like, inspection and enforcement and improvement. I believe that the two things can work in tandem, but they have to be separate as well in the context of the staff that are often doing one. Not always are the staff that are doing the second, improvement. So I believe that they can work, and I made reference to the fact that some of the changes that we made earlier on to our model attempted to strike that balance, because of course by improving early we can prevent harm and we can prevent poor quality care. So in that sense I believe they're part of a continuum that I think should be embraced within Scotland's regulator, and in fact, as you refer to, is actually part of the legislative makeup of the Care Inspectorate in Scotland. I think it's always to be alert to that tension and to make sure that we deal with the matters that we need to urgently, including safe care. So I think that we can balance them off and do so through our improvement strategy, through how we train our staff, and through ensuring that it's not always about improvement if we need to enforce immediate action to improve care.
Donald Cameron.
Obviously, you want to further what's described as a collaborative approach to equality within the care sector, and yet at the same time you have to regulate it. Are you content that you're able to do that?
Peter McLeod.
I believe that we are able to do that. I think that in my experience, and I would have to say that my journey has meant that I spent many years being inspected, and then I became the accountable officer visiting that process on services. So it's been a learning journey in that sense. But I suppose what that journey has taught me over many years is that the best of the services are those that take responsibility for monitoring their care, ensuring they know where it should improve, and then taking action to do so. And in that sense, I think it is in the spirit of collaboration. However, as we have seen during this pandemic, collaboration sometimes has to be compromised by the urgency to take action in the face of need and indeed in the face of safety and protection. And that is why we have taken some of the actions that we've outlined in the reports to Parliament. So I think it's a balance again to be struck, but I believe it's one that we do strike and can. And I think that's evident through some of the comments that received in submissions to the committee today.
If rules and compliance are required, who do you believe should set those rules? Should it be the Care Inspectorate?
Thanks. I think it should be the Care Inspectorate. I think that it's also depending on what rules and standards that we are adhering to. There's various parts of legislation that we require to be cognisant of in setting those rules and standards, including things like adult support and protection, the protection of children, the various legislative frameworks around the needs and the services that are provided in Scotland's care sector, including, of course, early learning and childcare. So I think that we should be, in a sense, the moderator and the body that judges how these standards are met. But equally, we strive to define these standards based on the experience and the lived experience of those receiving care. So I think it is a number of different aspects that form the frameworks that we use. And I'm confident that those are robust. But again, they are always under development, and we seek to learn and understand, not least during the experience of COVID-19 in Scotland.
Finally, can I ask you what you're doing to raise your profile as an organisation with the general public, and also raise the profile of the care sector itself?
Peter McLeod.
I think first of all, and I was interested to read the comments from many in the care sector about raising the profile of it through the work of the regulator. I understand that, as you see in the publication that I've submitted to today's committee, that gives an overview and seeks to share understanding of what has happened in the care sector, or one particular part of it, through COVID-19. So that would be one very recent example of how the profiling of what is happening in care is something that we would take forward. And we have many publications that we have on our website and beyond. I don't believe that, though, that we are the champion of the sector. I think that we can do so to some degree, but I believe it's an inherent tension to regulate and enforce action where that is required, and to champion at the same time. I'm not sure that these are in equal balance. So I accept that there is more that we can do, and there is more that we can say about the sector, and that is something that I've taken very much from the evidence presented to today's committee, and I will work very closely with partners to understand and take that forward. But again, I say that given the level of activity across 12,500 registered services in Scotland we're involved in, I believe that we cover and discharge our duties across all sectors in the way that the legislation intended us to do so.
Thank you very much. And I'll call George Adam.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, Peter. I'm only too well aware of Peter McLeod's history of delivery in this sector, because we worked together in Renfrewshire Council. But my question, Peter, today would be about the effect of COVID-19 pandemic had on the Care Inspectorate's activity itself. And I'm probably following on from some of David Thomas's questions, because many of the respondents were very positive about the support provided by your officers. So what have you learnt about your role and functions during this pandemic?
Peter McLeod.
Thanks, Mr. Adam. I think what we've learnt is that we must act quickly to change in the face of an unprecedented set of circumstances. That means that we apply judgments and decisions based on the best evidence possible, including when it is safe or not safe to inspect because of the risk of our inspectors spreading COVID through care services. So I think that one particular learning point, and I believe that the submission I've made to the committee today, Mr. Adam, illustrates how we did that, how we changed the contact levels, the scrutiny models that we employed, how we put in place red, amber, green status notifications to ensure that care services could alert us if they were experiencing difficulty with staffing levels, put in place virtual technology solutions to make sure that surveillance and examination of care settings was possible even when site visits were too dangerous to undertake. So I think the main learning is, and I'm glad to hear that reflection of the positive comments, is that we must guide as clearly as we can, but we must scrutinise and understand what is happening in services and absolutely critically provide assistance to them when they need it. This has been an awful tragedy that we have seen unfolding, the worst in 30 years in social services, of course, in the context of my career. And what we have been able to do is seek assistance, like get staffing to a service urgently when it needed it, through partnerships or other means, get PPE to services on almost 400 occasions during the pandemic when they desperately needed it, where it was available and possible to do so. So my main learning is to never, ever stop being determined to do the best that you can and adapt quickly and use the best advice to do it, but always, always have the focus of the individual that needs care at the heart of what you do.
George.
First time you ever called me Mr. Adam in all the years we've known each other. But with regards to older people in residential care, you know, they remain vulnerable to the pandemic. And how will you apply any learning you've had in the months ahead as winter approaches?
Thanks, Convener, thanks. I think that the learning is already there. What we have done is we have changed, I mentioned earlier on, the wraparound support to care homes. I think that is essential that remains in place. And I, amongst others, were very much advising early on about how those arrangements could be put in place to best effect, and working with the Directorate of Public Health, for example, to that end. We need to ensure that we are picking up intelligence. We changed our intelligence model to target those services most in need. And for example, for the first time, we were able to draw on sources of weekly assessment by Directorate of Public Health in Scotland, as directed by government in mid-April, to look at what they were saying about specific care homes alongside other evidence we had, complaints, previous inspection history, and a variety of other measures of intelligence that we could use. So I think it's that learning about ensuring that wraparound proactive support is there. We understand if there are difficulties emerging, we understand that as early as possible and seek to remediate, or the service provider does. And I think moving forward, it's looking in particular at how infection prevention and control can be more robustly and most robustly put in place. Therefore, we have just last week, received new UK guidance on clinical guidance on infection prevention and control, and we will put that in place very quickly with agencies like Health Protection Scotland. I think we'll also have to look at how the design of care services moving forward will be influenced by the realities of how COVID-19 is spread, not just in care, but across society. So much learning, but we are already doing that. I'm part of the Mobilisation and Recovery Group and able to contribute very centrally to that, along with other leaders across sectors in Scotland. Our learning and our influence and our advice is front and centre to the care sector in preparing for any future eventualities around COVID or flu or anything else that tests us.
Georgia.
Yes, and finally, Convener, Peter, how will the care inspector advise services and maintain it? Just following on from what you said there, how will it maintain the balance between infection control and respecting people's personal outcome and recognising that care homes are primarily people's homes and not hospitals? Do you think the balance was or is right?
Peter McLeod.
Thank you. I think that the balance in terms of a coronavirus that has taken the loss of life that it has across the face of the globe and tragically has targeted those often older members of our communities and indeed those in care settings, and again across the world, I think does cause us to reflect on the balance and the focus and how we then make sure that infection prevention and control is even more robustly in place moving forward. So I think that in terms of the sustainability of the sector, its ability to cope with such an event again, we have learned much, but we must be determined to continue to learn and continue to focus on the elements that makes care safer. I think that the balance question you ask, I am confident now that all parts of the services that are working together to get care supported and through this virus, that they are very clear that it is the balance that needs to be struck. Somebody's home is not a hospital, with very few exceptions, I suppose, for those in continuing care, and therefore we must make sure that they are homely or as like home as possible environments that strike the balance that you mentioned. And I believe over the course of COVID-19 we have rebalanced that, but we must keep our eye on the risk of what life and limb concerns and impacts that are arising from COVID.
Thank you. I now call Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Convener. Mr. McLeod, I was considering your answer earlier on when I was questioning you on clinical judgment and the fact that the clinical decisions result in patients being discharged into a care home setting. Can I ask what involvement the care inspectorate had in developing that emergency protocol, whereby local authorities didn't have to carry out the normal assessments of individuals being discharged, like consulting the individual? So what was your role in developing that strategy?
Peter McLeod.
Thank you. I don't believe we had a direct input into that development of that protocol. I understand its origins, where there was a requirement to look at assessing need very rapidly. So I think I would need to explore further and come back to the committee convener if there is anything further I can add to the question that Mr. Whittle has asked me.
Thank you, that would be appreciated. Brian Whittle.
Thank you. A wee bit surprising, surely care inspectorate must have a role in discussions of the impact of protecting the NHS by moving people out of hospital into a care setting. I would be surprised if you weren't consulted.
Peter McLeod.
Thanks. I will go and check what the level of discussion and involvement was. I think what I would go back to, Mr. Whittle, is that our role is to ensure that guidance is given to the sector in terms of how it manages infection prevention and control, along with Health Protection Scotland and others. And I've already explained the process by which decisions for discharge are made. I am clear about the protocols that I've shared with you in terms of my knowledge of practice. And in terms of contribution and consultation, I will go and check and come back to the committee what it is that our contribution was. And if that is more directive than I have suggested, then I will correct the record in that regard.
Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Mr. Because I really appreciate that. Because what we might be able to highlight here is a gap in knowledge here, because surely as I said earlier on, if we're discharging people from hospital into a care home setting, we should be taking cognizance of the impact on that care home. So I would appreciate, or the committee would appreciate, a follow-up on that. So can I just ask a final question, if I could, convener? There are a number of governing bodies or government bodies whose remit seems to cross over quite significantly. Do you think there's an argument for the Care Inspector and the Scottish Social Services Council to merge, or at the very least have a much closer working relationship?
Peter MacLeod.
We are co-located in our offices in Dundee. We work very closely together. We liaise very regularly, and indeed we have an element of shared services between the organisations. They have distinctively different but complementary features. One, SSSC is the regulator for the workforce for social care, and obviously we regulate the services, their quality and the standards that they aspire to meet. I don't think that it's a matter for me, given the legislative frameworks that operate between the organisations and upon which they are founded, to give you a judgment on that, because I believe we already work very closely together. For example, in the publication I've given you today for this committee, Mr Whittle, there are joint statements of practice that are recommended between myself and the accountable officer for the Scottish Social Services Council. I think that's evidence of that joint work. So it would be a matter for Parliament and the legislative frameworks that currently are put in place to discharge the key duties and functions that we are responsible for, to reflect on whether change should come forward in that way, and legislative change would then follow from that point of view. I believe that we work very closely together, and that works in the interests of the sector that we serve.
Thank you very much. And I now call Convener White.
Thank you, Convener. I couldn't quite make out what you had said there. Good morning, gentlemen. I know that most of the questions have been about care homes, but I would like to talk about care at home services. And I do thank you for your submission and the fact that how aware you are about the home care sector and the involvement in that as well. The first, I'll try and put the two questions together, if I may. Can I ask how the Care Inspectorate has been ensuring that those in receipt of care at home and support have been safe, also ensuring that staff providing care at home have also been safe, and have they been following guidance?
Peter MacLeod.
Thank you. I might bring Kevin Mitchell in as our Executive Director for some comment, but first of all, Convener, could I just say that we have been closely monitoring care at home services. We have, in fact, just about completed what we have termed as an inquiry into care at home services. There are just over 1,000 standalone care at home services. In addition, there are further over 1,000 that provide housing support. I can tell you that 16%, or around 169 notifications of COVID cases, were received from those services. That, I think, provides evidence as white of the kind of monitoring and awareness we have had of what has been happening within those services. We received many inquiries around the supply of PPE, for example, practice around care at home too. Our inquiry, though, more recently has just about completed. We have received responses from all, I think, or almost all health and care partnerships in Scotland, and we are about to publish a report that will give very clear detail in answer to your question, but will also then guide us as to what further inspection, intervention and other means that we need to employ to ensure that that part of the sector has responded and will continue to respond to the challenges, increased challenges of infection prevention and control moving forward.
Kevin Mitchell.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Convener and members. Just to follow on from what Peter has said there, in terms of the work that we did at the outset of the pandemic, the very significantly increased contact with services that we had included care at home services as they did care homes, and those contacts were clearly on a weekly basis at least, and often more frequently if the need arose. In actual fact, we continued to monitor notifications from those services. We continued to monitor complaints and deal with those. We continued to analyse on a daily basis, 7 days a week, morning and afternoon, the data that we received about notifications of outbreaks or indeed notifications of deaths. So that contact that Peter has described, the enhanced contact that we had with services, did include care at home and was part of the 35,000, almost 36,000 contacts that we had with 6,700 services over the period between April and July. So again, it was very important that we did that because, as has been highlighted by the member, supporting the services and signposting them where support was required, and indeed providing advice and guidance ourselves, was all part of that and included critically those care at home services. And again, Peter has alluded already to the work that we're currently undertaking, because we're aware that in some areas care at home services were scaled back at the outset of the pandemic. So the inquiry or the investigation work that we are undertaking, which is almost concluded, will actually give us a national picture of the impact, in terms of the decision making around care at home, how that care at home was prioritised during the pandemic, monitoring the impact of any changes to packages that were delivered, how the engagement has continued or not, perhaps, with service users, and it will also look at the recovery plan. And that will hopefully give us a sense of what we need to focus on and where, and that forms very much part of our intelligence-led and targeted and proportionate approach to inspection that Peter has alluded to.
Thanks very much. There was a reference to a review of care at home services, if I heard that correctly, in the previous answer. Can that be provided to the committee, please? Thank you very much. Sandra White.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was just going to ask roughly when the inquiry and the publication would be ready to be published, and if the committee could receive that, because I think one of the issues that you touched on very, very importantly there is self-direct support, and obviously local council supply home care support as well. So there's quite a myriad of providers. So it'd be very, very interesting to see exactly what comes out of the report, and thank you for the detailed response you gave me there. Now, we have had, obviously comments come in from various people, in fact some anonymous comments or people in regards to complaints about, non-service, care at home from the care inspectorate. How do you deal with these complaints about standards and quality of care during COVID-19, whether anonymous or not? And would these be included in this report, the inquiry report that you're putting forward?
Peter McClisk.
Thank you, Convener. The performance data that I've supplied shows how we have in fact dealt with a very large number of complaints and turned those round very quickly. I would need to, and I can provide to the committee following this session today, some more detail of where these complaints were specifically around care at home services. But equally, what we would do with those complaints is we would follow them up. We would talk to the provider of services. As we indicated earlier on in our evidence, the ability to visit services has presented a very real risk of the spread of COVID-19 by our staff. So what we have done is then gone to health and care partnerships and others to seek information in the round about any complaints or assertions of poor practice that have been made known to us. Clearly, we have compared that against the history of complaints we have in relation to the individual care service. and we have then taken a judgment or a decision about what action would be required to be taken. But yes, I am aware of a number of complaints, including anonymous complaints too. And in terms of the specific question about whether that would be included in the report, I think that we will look at whether it can be, given that the report should be published somewhere in the next 3 to 4 weeks, and that may provide some further contextual information around some of the question areas that you've put to me this afternoon.
Thank you very much. No more questions, but thank you for your responses. Very helpful.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our evidence session with the Care Inspectorate. Can I thank Peter MacLeod and Kevin Mitchell for taking part in this meeting and for answering so many questions, and look forward to the additional information which has been referred to in the course of this evidence session. Thank you very much. The committee will move in a moment into private session. We will suspend briefly and then resume in private session at 12:20. Thank you very much.